And I think we are live here on youtube.com/. We don't have enough subscribers to have our own address. It is Oscars night, but we are dedicated because we are writers and editors who love our job and love our work. And we also know that people can just tune in later because really. Which, by the way, if somebody actually, I need to open the chat so I can see in case if there is anybody hanging out with us. But welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our live stream. I'm Kyle V. Hiller. I'm going to be hosting the show tonight, and we are talking about crafting villains. And alongside me, we have a long roster of our Angel Editors team, including Denise, Diane, Jen, Ross, and Jay. How is everybody doing tonight?
Great.
Ed.
Awesome.
Wow.
Awesome.
All right.
So yeah, just loading up the chat. Why don't we talk a little bit before we get into the discussion? Like, what are we reading? What are we writing? What epiphanies have we had about storytelling the last week or two since our last stream? Let's talk. What's on our minds here? I know you guys are always thinking.
I'll start us off only because I think where I'm tracking is going to be largely different from everyone else's. So I have been reading a lot of scripts lately, specifically because I have a bunch of students where in the universities that I teach, we're starting to dive a little bit deeper into screenwriting.
Okay.
And so I've been reading more sort of non-traditional screenplay formats, specifically anyone who's interested, Walter Hill, any script by Walter Hill, whether it's the original Alien or The Warriors, even the script Wall-E is very much inspired by and based by Walter Hill's style. What I'm finding with it is that it's so lean, like it's so stripped down, and it's sort of the antithesis to the Hollywood format, anyone can make a screenplay format. It's not hard. But what he's doing, it almost reads as poetry. So that's been really kind of interesting to be diving into his work this week.
Great. Dope. Anyone else?
I'm so glad that you mentioned Alien because I will be talking about Alien tonight. Yeah, but so I just finished reading Dear Rachel Maddow by one of our VCFA colleagues, Adrienne Kisner. And I just started reading This Is Not a Love Letter by another VCFA grad, Kim Purcell. And both of those they're very different stories, but I'm really loving the perspective of This Is Not a Love Letter because it's written in second person. And I think that's a really difficult style to do well. And what I'm liking about it is that second person sort of disappears for a while, and then every once in a while you go, oh, that's right, this is in second person, and to me that's the sign of doing it really well when it sort of fades into the background like that. Right. So that's one of the things I'm enjoying right now.
Cool. Anyone else? Anything particular? No.
It's interesting. I just finished reading The Season of Styx Malone, which is by VCFA grad and current faculty member Kekla Magoon, and also won a Coretta Scott King honor this year. And it's pretty interesting because I'm not sure you can identify a villain in this book. It's or a real antagonist. It's a book, essentially the situation is there's two brothers and an older boy comes to their town for the summer and provides them with all sorts of attractions, doing things they shouldn't be doing. But he's someone that they befriend and they love, and yet he's the one that's creating conflict. So it was a great book. I really enjoyed it. Really love the rural setting, which is something you don't see a lot of. And I would recommend it highly.
Yeah, I liked that one too. I finished that one a couple weeks ago, and I agree. When we were looking at what villains have we seen lately, I pulled that one out. I was like, I'm not really sure. Because even the father in it, who is kind of thwarting the boy's attempts at growth, he's not doing it out of villainous reasons, which it's one of the things I'm sure we'll get into, is that every villain's the hero in his own story, right? So I think that that's where we are, and I think Kekla does that well by not making anybody too negative. She shows all sides quite well, I think, in that.
I was just thinking the same thing, Jen. I just reread The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle by Avi, which is very, very old book. Well, not very old, but early 90s, I think, is when it came out. And the captain in that book is definitely a villain and has villainous qualities, but there is a point where reading it as an adult now, I'm like, oh, he really doesn't think he's a villain. He really believes in like everything that he is doing. And so I'm interested to get into conversation about perspective and how perspective figures into villains in literature.
Cool. All right, so I think that is a perfect way to get into the conversation itself. As everyone knows, obviously we're talking about villains. And before we jump into that, I think something I would like to bring up is just where the whole where the word comes from, where the etymology comes from. And it comes from, the word villain is from a late Latin word villainus, which means the inhabitant of the villa. It was used by politicians, members of aristocracy, etc., to demean people who were less than knightly. So basically, those people were considered to be uncouth, impolite, or not chivalrous, or at least did not have the potential to be that. If you were just a normal person, you were regarded as villainous.
I love it.
It's crazy, right? So over time, the etymology of the word changed, and 1,000 or 2,000 years or so passed. No big deal. The word still exists. It's still very much in our vernacular, and I think it has taken on much more of a deeper meaning. And I think that's especially true in the narrative, in the contemporary narrative that we observe and read and write today. We really put a lot of thought and effort into crafting villains, more so than them just being these big, bad, evil beings who are just doing all the evil for no apparent reason. Because we're just normal people who end up doing evil things for no apparent reason. That's not how it works. We have motivation. So, anyone can take the question right off the bat. What do you feel like are the essentials to creating a villain in a story?
Well, I do think it is finding that positive, finding they can't be all one thing. They can't be two-dimensional badness. There is a saying here at my house, hey, even Hitler liked dogs. You've got to give us something to hold on to, something that makes the villain even slightly understandable. Otherwise, there's nothing to battle against. There's maybe even a hope for change in the villain, although they won't, but that you see moments of tenderness, or you see humanity. They can't be lacking in humanity, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think your point to that too, it's very much about like, that challenges a reader. If it's easy to hate, it's like, okay, cool, we can just hate that villain and that lets a reader off easy. But if your villain is somebody who you're like, wait, I kind of understand where they're coming from, or they have this redeeming qualities, it challenges the reader to say, well, what is villainous? What is bad? But I think in addition to that, I would add on, how is the villain blocking the main character? How are they getting in their way? I think is a really important part of any antagonist, whether it's a villain or somebody who is just, creating that barrier, that block.
Although I would argue, so I think you have room in genre fiction especially, to make your big bads really big and very bad. I think one of the most interesting things that J.K. Rowling does in Harry Potter is Voldemort. There's nothing relatable about the guy. There's nothing good about him. He has no good side. He is evil. But all the way through the series, he is posed as an opposite to Harry Potter. That they have these similarities, and that Voldemort chose one path which led him to evil, and Harry has chosen a different path that has led him to be good. So we understand, in book 6, we come to understand Voldemort and how he became that way. But I don't think he has many, if any, redeeming qualities, which is kind of interesting.
Would you, then I would Jane and I are like, wait. No, I would pose the question to you of, do you think it's that way for like his whole story? Do you feel like his whole story has no relatability or is it just sort of who he is in the present?
Well, it's interesting because we see in book 6, we get to see Voldemort as a child, and even then he's very unpleasant, but Dumbledore is giving him chances to change and to prove himself to becoming a better person. And Voldemort never takes these chances, which I think is part of the point of the series. There's a lot about free will, and our choices define us. And Voldemort made all these choices that led him to a bad place, and Harry is making very different choices. So even though they have all these similarities, I think that's a very interesting thing, that there's these connections, that there are very strong connections, that even Harry himself from the beginning is like, oh, well, Voldemort is also a Parseltongue. Could I be like him? It's a very interesting thing.
So Harry is relating to him, if you want to take it to that level. Harry is relating to him, and in that understanding of, if I take this choice, it leads down that path. So I'm going to go this way. I mean, so maybe that's where the relating comes from, is through our main character, through our hero, who connects more directly, even mind to mind, with this person, with this big evil. But and I don't want to jump ahead of anything, but it's like, this is why Harry is forced to meet lesser evils along the way first, because it's just, there's no way that the brand new, you're a wizard, Harry, is going to be able to manage Voldemort.
And I would say too that when you learn about Tom Riddle, you are building empathy for him as a character. You are building empathy for his history and for what he went through as a child. There is this little kernel of feeling sorry for him, and that is part of what you need to do for a villain. So even if Voldemort himself doesn't have any good in him, we see what he used to be, and we have that little sliver of empathy there, and every villain needs that. So no matter what, you have to create that somehow, some way. And that's where I think that even if Voldemort himself, as the full-fledged version of himself, doesn't have that, we understand through the backstory where all of that came from, and we still have that for him. We still have that empathy for him. So
I think I agree with what everyone's saying, and for me, I think my philosophy of villains is pretty simplistic, but it changes depending on what you're talking about. And you guys have already touched on it. You've all already said the things that I think about, which is primarily opposites. Like whether we're talking literally or we're talking metaphorically, figuratively, whatever, your villain needs to be in some way the opposite. So in the instance where you're talking about someone who's pure evil, who we as an audience can't connect to empathetically, right? We need to connect in some way, otherwise we can give a shit. So in the Harry Potter Voldemort, you guys know that world better than I, but just as an example, like in my world, I think of, again, I'm speaking more dramatically here, but Batman Joker in The Dark Knight, right? There's nothing to, other than charisma, there's nothing to really connect to Joker. The Joker wants chaos. Batman wants order. Those are opposites. But Batman can see that at some point in his life, he could have become Joker. They were the same people, but at a certain point, and you guys have said this already, they've just chose different paths, and they went in different directions and want different things. So while we can't connect with Joker, we can connect with Batman, and Batman can connect with Joker. So
Right.
we have that sort of darkness pulling us in a sense. But I totally agree with what you guys were saying.
I also want to go back to something that Jen said a little bit earlier, that you know, seeing the villain as the villain sees himself or herself as being the hero in his or her own story. I think that's something that we have to keep in mind when we're creating these scenarios, and that they always feel that they're doing something for a very specific reason, and it may not necessarily be for an evil reason. Well, for Voldemort, yes, it is, but and for the Joker, it's to create chaos. But for example, the alien, the creature in Alien. Here we go.
I'm there. I'm ready.
Yeah, there you go. Even that creature, though we as the audience see that creature as being completely 100% evil, when you get right down to it, the only motivation that creature has is procreation. That is all that creature is doing. It is 100% biologically programmed, and that's all it's doing. So once you kind of figure that piece out, that creature is really just doing what it's supposed to be doing, and it is the hero in its own story because it's doing what it needs to do to survive.
And I would argue that's what makes it a scarier villain.
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the first movies that I remember absolutely not being able to sleep and thinking about for weeks afterward. Like, the Jason movies and all of that, like those don't bother me. They really don't bother me. That bothers me. And I know that I'm never going to run into that creature, but I just still, to this day, I'm creeped out by that thing.
Just to piggyback on that alien thing too, to tie it into what exactly we're talking about, Ripley, right? Ripley comes to, and she finds out, and I forget if it's one or two, but it doesn't matter because the alien is the same in both, essentially, the procreation idea, right? She is a mother. Her daughter has died because she's still on Earth, and she's in this sustained state in space. So in a sense, when Ripley kills the aliens' eggs, they are the same. They are experiencing similar feelings of survival. They both have experienced a similar loss. So on a certain level, that makes them perfect opposites yet perfect equals. So you have this machine or this perfect balance of a machine against like the hero versus the antagonist.
But go one step further when she rescues the little girl.
Right, and add
she
new
becomes
to it,
a
right?
mother again.
Get layers, yeah.
Right. And now she's battling for the same thing.
Right.
She's battling to protect the child.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that what it's doing, what Jay's talking about, is that we have to put drive in our enemy. We have to put passion. And when you see that, I mean, here you have it in your hero, or at least the villain is hopefully starting that process off for our hero. But here we usually come upon a villain when they've already figured it out, and this is their goal, and they're going after it. And I think that that's the biggest thing to bring in, is to show that the villain has equal, if not more, drive and passion towards what they want. And it has to be relatable on some level.
So then in Alien, who is the villain?
Space.
Because no one can hear you scream.
No one can hear you scream.
I'll allow it. But no, I think that's interesting too, because I think so many narratives are starting to blur that line. And I think rightfully so, because, I mean, obviously, your hero is going to be the one that changes, whereas the villain doesn't. But, I don't know, maybe it's one of those things where the villain doesn't need to change, because at least they're more clear-cut on what it is that they want. Does that make sense? Like, why would a villain want to change in the first place?
Well, they don't. I mean,
Right.
I think your villain should be created the same way that you create whoever your hero or protagonist is. There's nothing different in terms of if you're just isolating, and for me, isolating that character, saying, okay, I'm going to develop my antagonist now. in my mind, you should put the same amount of effort, and maybe even to take that extra step to say, okay, and this person isn't willing to change, or this entity or this being or this beast or whatever it is, because the first 2/3 of your story, your hero, in my mind, has to feel like they're bested by their antagonist, that they're weaker than, less than, don't have it all figured out, so that you can build towards this turning point, and then we can see the ultimate failure or success. But I'm with you on that 100%. I think the more demonstrative an antagonist, for me, the way more interesting the story becomes, because your hero then is really locked into self-questioning and trying to then change and try different things to make their path easier.
Well, I absolutely agree. I think that when you start your book, your hero, your villain is 2/3 down the path of their arc already.
Exactly.
We just haven't seen their backstory. If we took this back half a book, we'd get to see all of that. And they're the ones who are instigating that hero, who are forcing the hero to act, because they've already made a decision, and the hero still doesn't even know there's a decision to be made. So I think you're absolutely right. We're just catching them later in their life story, or later in their arc.
And
I don't think they. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Diane.
Oh, I was going to say, because you raised a point that's interesting, that the antagonist isn't as open to change as the hero, and I think that's what we're looking for in the hero of the story. I think we had this conversation in our heroes discussion a couple weeks ago, that we want to see our heroes grow and change, because otherwise, why should we follow them on their journey? That part of what a hero is someone who's open to growth and to change and to overcoming and learning and getting stronger. So that if your villain is someone who is not open to change, that's an interesting juxtaposition. And then, of course, if you are dealing in more realistic genres rather than maybe fantasy or a mystery or something like that, if your antagonist has the possibility for redemption, that is a different kind of ending you can take, where they do find that change. And so you've got all sorts of kinds of possibilities with your villain.
I was going to say something similar. I mean, I wherever they end up, I think you're right that there's some complexity there of whether or not they change. But I think even beyond willing, they don't want to, and they don't think they need to, right? Like, I think that's for me what I see in really strong villains, is that they don't think they need to change. They believe that what they're doing is what they should be doing, the right way to do things. And if you were to flip their story, sort of like what Ross is saying, that you would have the main character, the protagonist, would be the villain for them, right? Because they're blocking them pursuing and going after this thing. So I totally agree that if you have a main, like a character, right? I think that it becomes a little more complex when you start looking at like an antagonist being an environment, or an antagonist suddenly getting out of the realm of character and getting into something that's a little bit more complicated to develop, but also can again, that whole idea of like getting in the way of the character. How is it getting in the way of the character from the character going after what they want?
I think the other thing to consider is that your villain is not going to have that all is lost moment, that dark night of the soul. Your hero does. And that's one of the main reasons that your hero has to change. Once your hero comes out of that's what forces that character growth. And the villain doesn't have that. So that right there changes that whole dynamic.
So what are the first things you go for when you are thinking about your villain? And as writers too, do you think about your hero first? Do you spend more time with your villains and then go back to your hero? What's everyone's sort of method in doing all that?
I personally start with the main character, whoever my main character or my protagonist is. That's because the villain needs to run counter to that. And so if I'm focusing on their story, I need to know what their story is. I need to know who they are, what they want, what they're passionate about, what their ideals are, so that I can counter that on the other side. Because if I don't know this, then it's hard to know what this is, personally.
And I will admit, I am very bad. I have a tough time trying to come up with villains. I tend to write a lot of heroes who are really struggling against themselves. So when they talk about the different types of conflicts you can have in a story, it can be man versus man, or let's be neutral, person versus person, or person versus society, person versus nature. I love those person versus self. And I've come to realize that even if I'm writing that kind of story, I need to have some kind of villain. And so I would agree with Denise. I always start with my main character, and because whatever their situation is, I need to set up someone who's going to counter that, who's going to throw obstacles in their way. And, that's a good way to do it.
Well, and even just building on that, like being a placeholder, right? If it is like character versus society, how is this character over here a representation almost of society and sort of speaking for society?
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, Ross, what were you going to say?
No, that's good. No, similarly to Diane, I think one of the things, again, speaking as more of the resident dramatic storyteller, although I'm a novelist as well, most of my fiction, my prose, my main characters are so internal. I think as many of us are, like we get locked in ourselves, we think about things, and oftentimes the first iterations of our characters are more internalized. And I love the person versus person sort of internal stuff. The one thing that the dramatic side of storytelling has really helped me with is when you're working in the dramatic world, your audience can only know what they see and what they hear, what's on the screen. So the internal world has to be externalized. And what's helped me as a prose writer on my prose side is being able to leap from or connect to or build parallels of the external. So one of my favorite films is Taxi Driver, which I think is one of the best character study films ever made. Regardless of whether you like it or dislike it, like it's a really intimate, deep dive into this fractured soul. And you could argue that he is his own antagonist and that he is an anti-hero, but everything is externalized, and there are things that he perceives in the external that help reflect back. So I absolutely agree. I think for me, I start with the character, and then I usually jump to something absurd, because that's just, as my agent says, you write unsellable things. I jump to the absurd, and then I reverse engineer it and figure out, okay, well, where is the opposite of this? That is the antagonist, and how can I build it up so that I'm entertained and keep myself laughing in dark ways throughout.
No, I absolutely agree with that, and I love how you put it. And I start with the protagonist as well, but it's when you switch the antagonist, sometimes they become a lot more fun to play with.
So
And as I'm developing that character, I'm starting to say, oh wow, see, they do this. Oh, but because they do that, now I can add that level to my protagonist. And it's so I would say, yeah, I definitely start with the protagonist side, but the protagonist definitely gets better after I've had a chance to run with the antagonist for a while.
So when you think about that, what are some of the technical things that you look for in, making your protagonist the opposite? Because I know we say that a lot, but what are some of the things that you think are key to understanding what about your hero do you want to make the opposite in your villain, if that sentence makes sense?
I'm going to go grab a beer, but before I do that, I think looking, like, sometimes I know, because I think about that all the time. I think about, like, I get stuck in my head about, well, what is the opposite of this? And sometimes it's as simple for me as what is literally the most immediate, even environmental thing that's the opposite. So if you look at Breaking Bad, right, you've got Walter White. Well, let's bring conflict, as much conflict as possible, towards that character. Oh, I know, let's make his brother-in-law a DEA agent. So now, while he's not the antagonist, we're bringing the opposite close. So when I'm dealing with an antagonist, sometimes it's just as simple for me as, it might seem too obvious. In my prose too, like it might seem too obvious to me. But as a starting point, that then begins to, and as you guys have said in much smarter ways than I have, elevate your characters so that as you continue to revise draft to draft and you move it up, you're starting simplistically for me, so I'm not overthinking it because I'm not that smart, and then it gets more complex and more interesting as I move through.
Cool.
I would agree. I mean, I think that there's something to be said for, like, again, knowing some of those basics of your character, you know, knowing what are they fighting for, like what are they fighting for, and what is standing in their way, and how can this character or environment or society, how is that getting in the way of them getting what they want? What do they have to overcome? And I think that the hard part for writers is we fall in love with our main characters, and we want the best for our main characters. And I think the challenge for most writers is making it hard, you know, like, don't make it easy for your main character. And so what is the hardest thing that could make this, you know, like what you were saying with Walter White of making his brother-in-law a DEA agent. I mean, talk about like immediately throwing in, how do you handle that? Like, let's throw this hugely complex thing on this, that it's not just that your wife might find out and leave you, it's that you might like go to jail for the rest of your life, you know? Like, so I think that again, it goes back to like understanding really the ideals and the goal of your character, and like what is maybe internally, what do they have to overcome themselves in order to do this? And so how can that antagonist or villain help that challenge be even harder, you know, make your character suffer.
No, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Sometimes it's not necessarily the opposite. Sometimes it's their greatest temptation. You know, sometimes you're going to imbue your villain with what scares you. What scares your protagonist much. But I really think when you can have the villain be able to offer temptation, to be able to offer up what the hero wants, but maybe not on the platter that the hero wants it on, then you're really going to cause struggle and that dark tea time of the soul, as Jay talked about.
or alternatively, your villain can embody everything that your character wants and is struggling to have. Mm-hmm. And then if to have your antagonist be aspirational for your hero, boy, can that can lead you to some really fun places.
So you're playing with jealousy essentially as the
yes.
Writer. Interesting. Do you know of any examples off the top of your head that do that?
Oh,
because I can't think
off
of any.
The top, no, not off the top of my head.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not all the way through it right now, but I'm reading Mercy Suarez Changes Gears by Meg Medina, which just won the Newbery.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not all the way through it yet, but I feel like even though she doesn't know it, she seems really jealous of what Edna has, which is sort of her main sort of, I don't want to call her a villain, but she's definitely making Mercy's life a lot harder. And so being able to have like a little bit of, I guess, I think I'm seeing it as jealousy, but there's a little bit of like, I wish I could do what she does. I wish that I could, you know, that I could command the room in the way that she does, or that I say this thing and everybody does it. But she doesn't know that. Right. And so I think that I can't think of anything where like a character knows, like, I want that, which I think actually is part of what makes it so interesting, is that I don't think she realizes that she wants what Edna has.
I feel like there's, I'm just trying to think, is the opening of Nova Rensuma's The Walls Around Us, because they're both dancers. And,
oh, right.
And
yeah.
there's dancers in competition. I feel like there's a lot of school novels or novels set in these really intense competitive situations like dance or music or theater, where you have that kind of aspirational jealousy and power imbalance, and that can be very fun to play with.
Isn't there a little bit of it in Star Wars? I mean, you know, hey, if you take the shortcut, Luke, You know, you're going to have your friends, you get the cool black robes, you know. there's a little bit there in that temptation moment. But I don't know about the rest of you, but I remember sitting in the theater with the second one, not the you know what I mean.
Get it straight.
Episode
The second, the third, the
5.
sixth, the ninth.
Yeah. Just thinking, don't leave Dagobah. It's a mistake. And but you know, it's like he wanted to.
I'm not the YA guy in the group. I again track in different fields, but and you can look to the film, but the book itself too, Fight Club.
Yeah.
Again, there's another twist which we won't spoil, but you have a main character, the narrator. I would argue is jealous of his antagonist or his friend. And he is strong in all the ways that he's not. He's charismatic in all the ways that he's not. He is sexual in all the ways that he's not, and like all these things. That you have a kind of it's almost when you realize the turn, you're like, if you didn't see it coming, you're kind of like, I'm an idiot, I didn't see that. But it's just kind of a good example, I think, in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing, who is a craftsman or a craftswoman, can execute a very simple opposite, and based in jealousy, going back to what Kyle was asking, and have it work, have it play.
You know, The Great Gatsby too might be.
Yeah, that came to mind.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
See, we're doing it off the top of our head, guys.
And I just thought of one, A Line in the Dark by Melinda Lowe, which is a really good suspense YA. The narrator, the antagonist is someone she's jealous of because of a personal relationship. And it's very twisty and enjoyable.
That's a fun surprise ending too.
Mm-hmm.
I liked that one, yeah.
Yeah, so we've got quite a few watchers in the YouTube video, so let us know in the chat what you think makes for an effective villain. If you have any ideas of different kinds of villains that you think are really interesting or compelling, let us know. Or if you are watching us after the live stream, just let us know in the comments and we will respond because we're here. So let's pivot though. Let's talk about the different types of villains, if we want to get a little specific. And I kind of have a list here, and we can sort of parlay back and forth as we go along. But we have, our big bads, which was popularized mostly by Buffy the Vampire Slayer back in the day, which is kind of crazy when you think about that. That show was kind of back in the day. And we also have anti-villains. Jen, you mentioned dragons when we were talking about this earlier. And then, what types of villains are there? What do we look for in them? And how can we rate them?
Well, I really like the anti-villain, which was I did not know what an anti-villain was until very recently, and when I kind of heard that term, I was like, anti-villain, what does that even mean? Does that mean hero? What does that mean? And when I did some research about it, I was like, this is really cool because you can do so much with this. I think you can do a lot with this. But for people who don't know what an anti-villain is, the anti-villain is always an antagonist, whereas your villain can sometimes be your main character. It can sometimes be your protagonist. I think that's something that we didn't explain very well in the very beginning of this chat. A villain is not necessarily an antagonistic role. It can be a main character. But anyway, the anti-villain is always an antagonist, and it's someone who uses evil methods for a noble purpose, or more rarely uses noble methods for an evil purpose. So an example of that would be like President Coin in Mockingjay. She's an anti-villain because she uses evil methods for what she perceives to be a very noble purpose. And what I liked about that is that, and I'm gonna spoil Mockingjay for anybody who hasn't seen it. when Katniss or hasn't read it, when Katniss has the opportunity at the very end, she's through all 3 books, she has sworn, I'm going to kill Snow. I'm going to kill President Snow. And she finally is in the arena, and President Snow has been captured, and he's up on the platform, and she's there with her arrows, and she's like, I'm going to get this guy. This is my time. And she lets an arrow fly, and she kills Coin. And it comes as a complete surprise to a lot of people. But if you understand the dynamic of the anti-villain, a lot of people saw this coming. And even if you don't necessarily understand what an anti-villain is, a lot of people were like, oh yeah, I knew it. And because of what she did to Prim. And so I think that's a dynamic that is really fun to play around with, because you can still have your villain, President Snow, but then you add in your anti-villain, and it just really amps things up. It really created even more tension for Katniss and for the entire book, the entire 3rd book of the Hunger Games series.
Would you call Dolores Umbridge an anti-villain then in Harry Potter?
I think of her more as an anti-villain than I do a villain, because she is 100% convinced that she's doing the right thing. 100% convinced.
Would you say Dexter too?
No, Dexter is an anti-hero because he is a protagonist.
Oh, okay.
An anti-villain is always an antagonist. Dexter is an anti-hero.
If anybody's watching, my brain is broken right now. So if your brain is broken, join me in doing a deep dive of research, because that is something I've never come across or even thought about. But it opens up such a huge world in terms of the story. My God.
I feel like everything becomes so complex. It just adds such a layer of complexity.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about it.
I thought when you started talking, what came to my mind was that when we lock into a protagonist and we watch it, where I thought you were going was, and we have an antagonist, and at the end, the antagonist is actually the protagonist, and the protagonist is actually the antagonist. And then when you went sideways, I was like, I'm done.
Pivot.
I think it just speaks to how we need to, as many different kinds of obstacles we can throw in the way of our heroes, whether it's a villain or an anti-villain, you just need to throw them all in there.
Yeah.
I had someone tell me once, a mentor of mine, drag as much conflict as possible into the house. And again, going back to Breaking Bad, look at that first episode and how much conflict he's faced with in that first episode. But just as an aside, yeah, absolutely.
I've been wondering, and maybe this comes into this conversation, Snape, again, the complexity of him, right? I personally think of him kind of as like this anti-villain, because he's not a villain, but he seems like a villain through like the majority of the story. I don't know. I'm curious of what people's opinions are on Snape.
He's not an anti-villain.
No.
He's an anti-hero, because he is there for good. An anti-villain is using noble methods for an evil purpose, or evil methods for a noble purpose. Yeah. He's doing neither. He's an anti-hero. So he's doing something for good. And we might not like his methods, but he is doing something for good reasons.
He's redeemed. He's redeemed.
He's redeemed. Yeah.
I think when we were talking about how the villain has gone down these paths and has made a choice. This was Snape's last crossroad, and he chose the other way. And this is what we got.
Yeah. But going back to what we originally talked about, just to throw a little curveball into this, if the villain is getting in the way of the protagonist, doesn't Snape often get in the way of Harry? Doesn't he often thwart?
But does he ever use evil methods?
No.
He just does that because he's a dick. It's
Don't be a dick.
not for evil.
Don't be a dick.
Yeah.
If you don't be a dick, it's like the best way to live life. Just don't be a dick.
The only time he uses evil methods is when he kills Dumbledore, and he has to do that at Dumbledore's request. He's not doing that because, if that were a pattern of behavior, then I would say yes, he was an anti-villain. But he doesn't regularly use evil methods for a noble purpose.
And I would look at, there's going to be a lot of probably middle grade stories where your villain, you're not going to have a villain. You're going to have an antagonist who is mom or dad, because mom and dad love you and mom and dad want to keep you safe. And so they don't want you to go out and do anything, which is boring. And so for a middle grade protagonist to get around that and actually take action that's going to lead to growth, they have to go against the rules of mom and dad. And I'm sure there's a lot of young teens who would like to call their parents villains, but
38-year-olds as well.
But I don't think the way we've been defining them with that, they're antagonists. So I think we've made a point there. There's a difference between an antagonist and a villain.
Right.
I feel like we could go on for forever about that. I feel like
we so could.
What, like, our next live stream, or one of our future live streams, where we can really do our research and dive deep into that, because that is how you make those convoluted plots. And I think a lot of writers, including, probably ourselves, where we try to make those really complex narratives like that, adding characters here and there, but not really understanding what their purpose is, and also thinking about, okay, well, these characters understand what's happening in my story so well that they're going to go against what I would expect them to be doing in the first place. And I think that's kind of a way to think about how you can craft whether you're making an anti-hero or an anti-villain. No, that's my brain really hurts now, though. So
right, I'm gonna hire Jay in a minute to figure out my anti-villain nonsense in my script.
This one, let me tell you, you can write like a whole book on that. But Jen, you mentioned dragons.
Yeah, so this would be, I guess, along the lines of these layers of complexity, what you're going to be throwing at your hero. And I was doing a thing about villains, and I realized that when we first meet our hero, they often aren't ready for that big bad, for that ultimate test. So a good choice might be to think about Frodo. He has no abilities at all to go up against Sauron, or to even get to Mordor. If you want to look at Mordor as the villainous place, he has to battle and overcome smaller obstacles and grow and grow and grow. And I started thinking, these are the dragons. This is, as the big bad sits there in his castle, he's not going to risk himself for some upstart. We've seen that happen too often. He's going to hang back, and he's going to send out his dragons. He's going to send out the Nazgul. He's going to send out, he's going to turn Gollum. He's going to do all of these other things that our hero is going to have to battle through and wade through and grow and learn skills. And so it really is kind of a gamer mentality, where you've got to go through all of your boss battles until you get to the big boss battle. Yeah. And I really like the idea of, especially in series, I think it works well, because you need to complete that arc in every book. And so if you're defeating a dragon in each book, and yet for the long story, for the long arc, you maintain the villain, it helps you raise stakes, it helps you build tension, it helps you do all of those things in each story, and you get satisfaction at the end of each story, but you can keep that idea of a greater evil intact.
And I think that's applicable to whatever kind of story that you want. That we want our narrative arc, our hero's journey is they're going to take one little step and have to overcome. They're going to find some kind of conflict or obstacle. And each time the obstacle needs to get greater. I was actually talking with one of my critique partners this week, and she's writing a romance, and we were trying to figure out, okay, she's struggling with the structure. And I'm like, well, you have the moment, you have the moment of the initial attraction, and then maybe they're fighting the attraction, and then they're about to accept the attraction, and then something happens to interrupt that. And so then they have to take a step backward, and okay, then they've got the attraction, they're fighting the attraction, they've almost come to the attraction, they're going a little step further, then something bigger gets in their way. And it's, even if you're writing romance, that's the kind of trajectory you want your story to take, is it gets a little bit harder every time so that it means more when they finally win at the end.
Well, and I think,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that you can then get also the complexity of the big bad. That can be a character that really challenges your reader in terms of, oh my gosh, I see where they're coming from. I have sympathy, or I hate what they're doing, but like, I understand why they're doing it. And then still have your minions, I think is a way you've phrased it in the past, Jen, we can just straight hate them. You can make them in such a way that we can be like, you suck and I hate you. And we still have the complexity up here of the big bad who's overseeing all those little minions at the bottom.
Absolutely. 100% love this idea of Dragon's going to hire 3 of you when we're done to help me with my shit next. But for me, like taking it into the arena that I work in, so which is largely genre crime specifically. I just read, and to jump back into prose for a bit, because I don't just watch movies. Would be I read The Force by Don Winslow and Bill Beverly's incredible Dodgers, both literary crime. In The Force, the big bad, right, essentially would be internal affairs. Like they're coming down on a protagonist who is a corrupt cop in New York City. And so all the minions, and this is in real time, this is what I'm thinking when I'm listening to this dragon conversation, right? All the minions that he's having to face specifically are, conversations with his, with his girlfriend that he's having an affair with on his wife, or that we know as an audience are probably being recorded and tracked, or we're talking about, a rip that they took off of the street, and that he, split the money between his crew rather than turning it in. So like those little things to me are the dragons that we know from the start. We have this internal affairs investigation that's taking place. So even just taking the word dragons out of that and applying it to something else, it exists and it works. And exactly what everyone's saying, just continuously complicating at every turn. We wake up and we want our fridge to be full of food, and our cars to have full tank of gas, and there'd be no ice in the windshield, and our babies to have slept 19 hours. And there is no food in the fridge, and there is no gas in the tank, and the baby has slept 30 minutes. And that is an interesting story. We don't want boring things. So I think making our characters suffer with dragons connected to what that antagonist force is the key.
I mean, an empty fridge is probably the biggest dragon in my life. So to that.
And laundry.
Oh,
laundry.
See, and I think that could be also one of those things that helps people build those mundane stories, or the stories that are kind of the slice of life thing. Think of all those obstacles as the dragons, and also try to exploit that experience as much as you possibly can, because every time how many times do we walk into the refrigerator or the kitchen and go to the refrigerator, unless you have a walk-in refrigerator, which is really cool. You look and it's just nothing there, and you think, man, either I'm lazy, or I don't have money, or all 3, who knows, I don't know what it is. So it's like, I think that's really cool that we could just really think about how can we just put so much pressure on our characters as much as possible.
Well, and I think what you're talking about too, you get into sort of what you were saying earlier, I think, Diane, about like there's a difference between antagonist and villain, right? It allows you to have maybe a villain in a story, but then multiple antagonistic elements. One of my I've mentioned it a couple times because it's like one of my favorite things when authors are able to create environment as an antagonistic force. How is the environment itself standing in the way? Probably my love of historical fiction, of the way that the place that you're at and the time that you're at can itself be an antagonist in the story. But what you're saying right there about food, and I could get into a whole other conversation about the ways in which food can sometimes be antagonistic forces in stories, and the way that they can be representative of something a much larger antagonistic force. I'm now totally losing the book in my head, but there's this wonderful book, Waiting for Normal. There it is, in which I think I'd mentioned this to you, Kyle, at one point.
It's in my notes.
In which the character has a neglectful mother, and to fool her grandfather into thinking that the mother is not neglectful, she fills up an old pasta box with thumbtacks so that if he presses it, it sounds like there's food in there. And it's such a, like, I don't know, it's such a representation of the antagonistic force, which is this mother who is, not able to be present for her child. So I think that antagonistic force versus villain, I feel like we could go off on a whole other hour-long conversation about the differences between those.
Yeah,
absolutely. Just to drop this in, and this will take us on a whole spiral also as well, so maybe for later. But the thing that came to mind earlier too, and you asked a question about sort of how do you figure out what category they fall into, the three that I always present to brand new storytellers just as an entry level is, are they evil, are they everyday, or are they immoral? Like, as just sort of fundamental, and not saying that you can't be all three, but just like, the alien would just be evil, right? They're not doing anything immoral, and they're not an everyday, so that would be an evil. Versus an everyday, which would be, if I have a job interview and I have a flat tire and the universe seems to be against me and my suit's wrinkled and my resume's flown away. That's a terrible story, by the way. Don't read that book. But like, you get the sense of those three. But as an entry point, just it can be anything. But how does it complicate?
But see, and this is what I find happens. A lot of the new authors that I see, and I bet that it's the same for you, is they create a villain that is so quintessentially bad or evil that it's like, well, this kid doesn't have a shot. It's like, 5-year-old Johnny waking up and there's Satan. Hey, let's go to war. And it just can't happen yet. It can't. We're trying to suspend our disbelief, but they've made a villain that is so villainous, and they confront that right away. It's like, well, where's the tension? Where's the stakes raising? Where's the opportunity to see this get better? And so you end up getting bored with the battle.
That's interesting. So how soon do you think we should be introducing our villains or our antagonistic forces, our dragons, in the stories?
Well, if your villain is the main character, because it can be, remember that a villain is a character type, not a plot role. An antagonist is a plot role. A villain is a character type. So if your villain is your main character, right away. But if your villain is your antagonist, when do you introduce your antagonist? Same thing.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to working with writers or students, it has to be ballpark to when the desire is laid out, whatever that motivation is, right? Because you immediately have to complicate it. You immediately have to supersede to make it difficult. You don't have a story without conflict. So whatever that initial conflict is, it's got to be tied to Victor LaFale. In one of our Twitter chats that we had, I'm friends with him, and I messaged him. I said, and it was NaNoWriMo, and I said, do you have any advice for NaNoWriMo? And he goes, do you have an antagonist? If you don't, you probably should. And I love that. It's so simple. He's an incredible writer. And it was as simple as, what do they want and why can't they get it? And it's got to be tied to the antagonist. So I think that's generally my gauge.
Cool.
And I think that passion or their footprint on the story, definitely, they might not have to show up right away, but their influence has to show up. Their footprint has to be there. And I guess this is what I'm saying when we may, we know in Lord of the Rings, we know Sauron's out there. We don't see him. Actually, we never really do. but we see his influence. We see his intent, his path, his dragons. We see those, we confront those, we battle those. And so I think, it has to be there as the driving force, the motivating force, the thing that gets the hero off the darn couch or out of Bag End and on the road.
Was that a Lord of the Rings reference?
It was.
Showing my cards there, people.
So, speaking of which, Denise, what did you take from your Dungeons and Dragons, and did you learn anything about villains while you were playing?
Okay, so for those who don't know, I just played my first Dungeons and Dragons game last night. It was entertaining, that's for sure. I think, it's interesting. I think that one of the things that it reminded me is how it's helpful to sometimes step outside of your main character. Because I think we get so focused in on our main character and what our main character's doing and what we're going after that we forget to step outside and just think as like a world builder, As writers, I think it's important to be able to look at the world and go, oh man, that would really suck. So let's do that and let's amp that up. Let's elevate that, and also to take risks. I think that there's something to be said for, when I'm working with new writers and I often will teach in class, like, here's a writing exercise. You have 10 minutes, just write nonstop, go. Like, don't question it. Don't stop. If you write and over and over again, that's totally fine. And one of the things I often say in that is if a dragon walks into your scene, roll with it. Don't scratch it out. See what happens, because you don't know what that could lead to. And so I think that some of the stuff we've gotten into tonight has been really focused on, I think, what you would start thinking about in revision. But I think when you're thinking about drafting, it's important to, especially with antagonistic things, take a risk and blow it up. Make it, that's another thing Dungeons and Dragons taught me. When in doubt, throw some fire.
Let's
blow some stuff up.
You totally sidestepped the most important question, which was, who is your character?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So my character, sorry, my dog is trying to jump off me. My character's name is Susan.
She's the elf.
she's a high elf. My dungeon master, did I say that correctly? Dungeon master?
Sure did.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. My DM, he had us start in a tavern, and so he was like, everybody go around and say why they're here tonight. And in my head, I instantly, of course, like writer brain was like, I'm not going to say why I'm really here tonight. I'm going to come in with like all of this backstory that you don't know yet. But the thing I will say is that I came in here tonight because I need to get motivation. Exactly. What is my motivation? I came in here tonight to get wasted. I need to forget my life.
Because you're a high elf.
Because I'm a high elf. And I said, that joke came up multiple times. But, throughout the story, I would like go kill somebody, like shoot a firebolt at somebody. And then he'd say, what do you want to do next? And I'm like, get me 30 more feet towards the bar, please. And it was just this game of how drunk could my character get as she went along.
Sounds like a Wednesday night at my house.
And so she just continued to get drunk. And then she'd be like, all right, fine, I'll go kill this person for you. And now can I go back to the bar, please? She was snarky.
A little backstory in that statement. I need to forget my life. I mean, right there, heads explode. It's like, dang, okay.
So I have to say, like, having an acting background, I think it helps me a lot when I'm looking at manuscripts, and then when I'm also working with students and when I'm writing myself. And there's this great book called Audition by Michael Shurtleff. It was written in like the 70s, and it was how to prepare an audition, but it's also a really great way to examine a scene and how you can how you create a scene. And one of the things he talks about, one of the very first things he talks about is the moment before. And he looks at it from two different angles. He looks at it from like the backstory of the character, what happened before the character came in, and then immediately right before, like what happened right before this character came in. And so how does that change the way that they enter the scene? And I found that this is such a useful idea when developing any secondary characters. So getting into things like your antagonists, your villains, what is happening off stage for them that they're then bringing to the table, and immediately right before too, you know, the difference between somebody who comes in and figures their way out in the scene, what they're doing, and the person who like throws the door open, walks in, grabs a bottle, chugs the whole thing, slams it down, and then says, "Who wants to play some chess?" You know, like there's a difference there in what happened right before for that character, right before they came in the room.
This is a chat. This is a whole hour.
Right.
To tie this in quickly, and I could not agree more, one of the things that I tell any writers, whether I'm working with someone who's working in prose or story writing, novel writing, or I'm working with dramatic students or writers, it's take an acting class. And you don't have to, like, not to be an actor, forget that. Because actors, that's the shit that they do, right? Like they look at a scene and they say that cliched phrase, "What's my motivation?" But that's what you're doing as a writer. Like if you're writing a scene, I'm doing this tomorrow with my students. I just prepped this lesson. Like, you're going to write this scene. What's it about? What do people want? And when you're talking about, to tie it back in, because I'm good like that, when you're talking about antagonists, you're talking about villains, right? You have a scene. Like write a scene where your protagonist and antagonist, your hero and your villain, they meet each other. What are the motivations in that scene? If you take an acting class, it's uncomfortable, but it puts you in the actual literal space of inhabiting a character that you're doing in your head on the page, and it's a different experience to do that. So just as like a throwaway tip, if you have the opportunity, community, college, whatever it is, like whatever level, I highly recommend it.
Oh yeah, I mean it is a huge part of my writing process. It's a huge part of when I teach, when I work with any writers on their work. It's constantly in the back of my head. It's so funny because tying back into our whole conversation, as we were talking, I was thinking about an exercise we used to do in school where one person would jump up and they would choose somebody and they would say, "Come into my scene with me." And you wouldn't have any idea what the scene was going to be about. You wouldn't have any idea who you were, nothing. And the person who picked you starts the scene and you have to kind of like just jump in. And your whole goal in that scene is to not give them what they want. They're trying to get something from you and you cannot give that to them. It was such a good scene. And one of the most successful times I ever saw it done, somebody jumped up and she came up to him and she said, "Give me my money. You owe me my money. Give me my money." And he was like, "Oh yeah, baby, I got your money. Just, can you work like one more night for me? Like, and at the end of the night, I'll give it to you." She's like, "No, you need to give it to me now." And he was like, "Baby, you know I'm good for it. I'm going to give you your money." And it was this wonderful thing because he was like, yeah, I'm going to give it to you. I will totally give it to you. Can you just hang out here for 1 second? And hey, why don't you go take that customer while I'm going to go get that money? So he was like giving her what she wanted, but not giving her what she wanted, right? And it was such a useful exercise in terms of exploring character dynamics in a scene of how can you give, especially with your main character, how can you give your main character what they think they want, but it's not what they need and it's not what they actually want, you know? And that complexity and sort of working opposites, right? I could go on. I should not.
I went to a murder mystery party as one of the first dates with my current partner of 4.5 years, 5 years, and I was the murderer, and no one in the room of about 30 people knew until the very end. I was one of the last 2 people to be chosen and put on stage, and like, who did it? And everybody voted me, but my strategy was that I wanted to go around the room and ask everyone what it was that they wanted. And whatever it was that their character wanted, I was going to use that against them in such a way that, like, I'm going to figure out how to get you this thing. So I don't know if that makes me an anti-villain, but
let's bring Jay in on this.
Right. But that's one of the main strategies that I feel like, you know, you kind of go into just practicing and trying to understand what motivation is, because a lot of that motivation does parlay off of the other characters in the story too, and using that against them or whatever, because those wants also may represent what a weakness may be in the character that you're dealing with. Because they don't have that thing, they need it, or at least they think they do. They don't have it, they're going to go get it, they're going to fail, they're going to try to get it again. The person that we're going against, the villain, quote unquote, has it, and then the hero has to try to get it, and all these other things happen. So just go to a murder mystery party, everyone, and you will become an expert writer.
Well, and I think you bring up a good thing too, of the idea of, you know, when you are stepping into that role, when you have to play a villain, it's so much fun playing villains.
It's so much more fun.
It's so much fun.
I just also feel bad because I'm like, well, my partner didn't know that I was the liar the whole time, so that's probably not a good way to start a relationship.
No, maybe but get it out of the way, you know.
I've played the villain before, and you have to understand why. You have to know why they do what they do, and you have to humanize them for yourself. And you also have to take care of yourself when you're, you know, and take care of, like, your, you know, very much self-care in those moments of doing that, which I think is important for writers to do as well. I don't think we take care of ourselves enough, especially when we're writing really challenging things. But it's important to step into that role and be able to feel like what you're doing is what you should be doing, and it's what you deserve, and it's you have a right to it, and you have a reason for why you're doing it, and maybe people don't like your methods, but this is the thing I need to do. I have to do this, right? And I think that playing a villain, like you said, taking an acting class, going to a murder mystery show and being the villain, it gives you an opportunity to kind of see that other side of how do you come into this and humanize this character.
Cool. I feel like we have touched on a lot of great points. I think it's safe to say that we could probably wrap it up here at this point. Does anybody have any final concluding thoughts about what we talked about today, or how are we feeling?
Feeling great.
Okay, so we are all uncouth in the village, basically.
That's right. Not alone.
All right, so let's go around the room. If everyone can tell us where we can find you on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you may be. Denise, if you want to let us know, you can start off.
Yeah, I am. I don't think there's many Denise Santamaros out there. It's kind of a unique name. But I am, I believe, D.A. Santamaro, Santomauro on Twitter is my handle, which I believe is also my handle on Instagram. And I have a website too. You can check out all of those things.
Nice. Diane?
You can find me at dianetelgen.com. Telgen is Telgen. And I am on Twitter as Original Neglet. And Neglet is Telgen spelled backwards. Someone stole just plain Neglet. So I am the original Neglet on Twitter.
There you are.
All right. Let's see. We got Jay.
I am at Jay Whistler, JayWhistler, on Twitter, and my website is jaywhistler.com.
Nice. And Jen?
I'm Jen Bailey, 2 N's, so JENNBAILEY, and I'm that everywhere. I was on Twitter early enough, don't ask, that I'm actually it, man. I'm Jen Bailey. And there are a lot of them out there. And that's my website as well.
Ross.
Yeah, so JR Angelella, ANGELELLA, pretty much everywhere. Website, Twitter, where I am mostly.
Cool. And you can find me at Kyle Literally on Twitter and Instagram. You can find my writings and all that other good stuff at kylevhiller.com. You can find all of us at Angel Editors on Twitter. We are also on Facebook at / Angelella Editorial. If you forget how to spell that, it's Angel and then Ella like Fitzgerald, or Angel Ella like Umbrella Ella,
Ella.
There you go. And then also find us at angelaeditorial.com. We are looking to do more live streams and things like that as well. I hope everyone has enjoyed it. Please hit the like button. Check out everything in the comment section, or not the comment section, but the description below. Please subscribe, and you can get notifications for whenever we do go live. We try to go live twice a month. We also host Twitter chats, which we announce when they are coming along. You can also sign up for our newsletter to find out, and also maybe even get a discount on our editorial services. Thank you everyone for joining us, for watching us. Thank you all of the Angel editors for joining me tonight and talking about my favorite part of the story, the villains. I did not wear my cape this whole time. I just realized.
What?
But you know what? It's fine because the evil is within all of us. And I think that is a good note to leave it on. Thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic night. Enjoy the rest of the Oscars.